In this video, we will take our number 2 grains particles and explode them away. So we will take our Fluid Effects sim and we will then advect those particles using an xpExplosiaFX simulation. So let's get started. So here we are in our number 3 grains scene, where our number 3, if we play this through, it is obviously a granular simulation, and as this fall off comes up, which activates the gravity, we get this really nice kind of crumbling of our number 3, which then reacts with our hidden number 2 geo, and then we get our number 2 shape. So what we need to do before we can actually cache these grains particles is we need to actually advect them. So we need to kind of include this in the next scene as well. So let's just carry on playing this through up to, say, I don't know, frame 75. So there we go. There we have got our number 2. And now what we need is we need these to explode outwards with our coloured smoke simulation. And that is called particle advection. So we need these particles to be live. They can't be cached, or that isn't going to work. So because this is actually quite a complex scene that we need to build here, and it'd be nice to keep our grains scene here just as a separate one. So let's start this as a whole new scene and subfolder. So to do that, let's go to File and we will go Save As. So we're in our XP Countdown 3 Grains and Advection folder. Let's just go back up one. So let's just create a new one. So we'll go New Folder, and we'll call this XP. So this one's going to be XP Countdown, and this one's going to be 2. And what can we call it? We could call it Advection. Advection. Okay. So this one, our previous one, let's just rename that actually. Let's rename and just take that advection off, because it's going to be more sensible to have that split. So look, we'll just have that as XP Countdown 3 grains, and then we now have got our 2 advection. Great. So let's just copy that name. We'll go into that folder. Let's paste that in, put a version. Very good, and save. Oh, and actually, let's do we didn't do a cache folder in there either, did we? So let's go to MoGraph Countdown Library. Here's our new folder, and let's go New Folder, Cache. All right, excellent. So now we're ready to go. Let's close that down. So now we have our new scene with our live grains sim ready to go. Excellent. So I'm just going to hold Control and Alt, deactivate that grain sim for now. So what we need to do is we need to create an xpExplosiaFX explosion which emanates from our number 2 object. So let's just have a little look at that number 2. So this is the collider object that we use to drop the grains onto. So what we could do, we need to make some adjustments to this, but we don't want to adjust the collider object, otherwise it's going to mess up how our grain particles are reacting. So let's just make a copy of this number 2 collider, and let's just make the other 2 invisible. So on the copy, this is just going to be our emission object to make our explosion. So let's get rid of the collider tag, because we don't need that. And let's call it number 2, and it's not collider. Let's call it number 2 EFX source. Okay, that makes more sense. Now we want this to, if you look at my mouse cursor, explode outwards from these areas. We want them to be exploding out. We don't really want explosions from the caps. So what we could do is we could just go to the mode text object, to the caps, and let's put the start, just put none, and the end put none, and now we don't have any caps on this extrusion. We just have the extruded geometry. Very good. So that's actually going to work for us. So let's make that, get rid of that sky. There we go. Okay, so there is our number 2. Good, and let's just, we don't need to be able to edit this. Let's just make that editable by hitting C. And now that is an editable object. Actually, look, by hitting C, what it does, it creates the kind of extrusion and spline that is happening under the hood of our MoText object. So we could just connect all of this and then delete and connect to make it one object. But actually, if I just hit Control Z to undo, let's go back to our MoText. A really quick way of making a MoText object like this editable and having just one single polygon object is if we go to the menu here and bring in a connect object. Let's put the number 2 in the connect, and with the connect highlighted, let's just press C, and now we just have one object without all of those kind of nulls and hierarchies and splines and extrude objects. So that's a much quicker way of making MoText and all of these kind of parametric objects, making them editable as one object. Excellent. So let's just rename that as well. So we'll call this, what did we call it? It was 2 EFX source. There we go. Excellent. Right. So what we want to do is we want this to be a source of an emitter, and we're going to set up a new particle system now, which is just going to be for the xpExplosiaFX explosion. So what do we need to do that? Let's go to the xParticles menu, bring in a system. So here's our new system. Let's rename it straight away, and let's call this one System EFX. And do you know what? Let's just change the icon color to something very different, just so we can see it. Okay, and then I'm actually going to deselect the icon, but this icon is remained that new blue color, which is what I want. Very nice. Okay, so let's just make this one visible, and I'm going to put my 2 EFX source geometry into the other objects, so we're keeping it nice and organized. All right. So we have a default emitter brought into this scene. If we hit play, it's just going to spit particles off into the +Z direction. That's not what we want. We want these to come from our number 2 geo. So let's go to the emitter, to the object tab, and we'll change the emitter shape from rectangle to object. Let's drag in our number 2 EFX source. So now what's happening is all of these particles are flying out from the polygon center. So let's perhaps want it a little bit more random than that. So let's put polygon area. That's looking good. And you'll see what's happening is this isn't actually right, and it might be a little difficult to see, but what's happening is these particles are shooting inwards, not outwards. If I just go back to the beginning, let's just go forward a couple of frames. You can see, look, they're going inwards. We want them to be firing outwards this way. And that's because it's the way in which the normals are calculated when we use MoText objects. So if I just go to our 2 EFX source object, go to the polygon view, just hit Control A to select them all. Look, I've got my normals view activated. Look, all the normals are pointing inwards. So we could do the command to reverse those normals so they're pointing outwards, but actually we don't need to because there is a function to be able to just do that in the emitter. So let's go to our emitter, and look, we can go to invert. So it'll invert this normal particle direction. So let's just hit invert, and now you'll see they're firing outwards. Excellent, that's what we want. Perfect. So let's hit play. There we go. All right. Now what we want is we want this to be a blast of particles that will become an explosion. So we don't want them to be just firing out all of the time. We want them to be kind of shot out in a short amount of time. So we've done this before when we've changed the emission mode from rate to shot. Let's just do that, put it on shot. And now, bang, one shot of particles on the first frame. And you could kind of make it a 3-frame duration with more particles. But again, this is not quite what we want. We are going to actually use something that many people forget about, and it's a fantastic way of emitting particles and giving a little bit more control as to as and when particles are being emitted. So this is what we'll do. We are going to change this emission mode from shot back to rate, and now it's just firing out all of the time. But we're going to use an emitter fall-off to give a nice bit of variation to as and when these particles are emitted. So the way we do that is we're going to go to the Object tab of the emitter, and you can see, look, in the Object Properties, we have a fall-off tab. So let's click on that. And what we are going to do is create a box fall-off. So there's our box fall-off. And what we want to do is we want to adjust this fall-off to, let's just move it like that, and we want it to be probably quite thin, something like that. And then we want to, let's rotate that emitter, which rotates the fall off. Okay, and then I'll hit E and then W, so we're in world space, and I'm going to move it out the way. So what it's saying is the emitter will only emit particles when the object from which you're emitting is inside the volume of our fall-off. So if we hit play now, there's no emission. But then if we take our emitter, which moves the fall-off, look, as we move through, it emits particles from that object. So that's pretty neat. So what we're able to do here is go vroom, and we get a really nice, more random emission of particles. So that's a really neat trick. Fantastic. So let's take this, and we want to keyframe it. We want to keyframe it at the right time. So let's look at at the timings of this. So the timings are dependent on our grains sim and when we want these grains to be advected from their number 2 crumbled state. So what we're going to have to do is reactivate the system grains and find out exactly when we want this advection to start. So let's do that. We'll reactivate our grains system by holding Control and Alt. Click on that, which activates everything underneath it. We'll also need to activate our 3 grains collider and our emission object, otherwise we're not going to get any particles. Let's just make that invisible. Right, and we can actually deactivate our system exposure effects at this point because we're just looking for timing. So let's just hold Control Alt, click on that, we'll minimize it. Right, so we'll play through this. There are our grains, and obviously this is a fluid effects sim, so that isn't cached, so it's not going to play back in real time. So here we've got our transition into our 2, and we need enough frames for the 2 to be obvious as a 2 for the countdown to work, and in all of the other transitions it's around 2 seconds. Okay, so here we go. So at around kind of frame 70, we have an obvious number 2 forming. And remember, let's put 300 frames in our timeline just for now. So this could be more than enough. Obviously, that's 10 seconds in our frames per second in our project settings. So we have our number 2. So arguably, we could start this advection quite soon at this point because the grains aren't going to move immediately because the exposure FX sim has to develop first anyway. So we're going to we want about 2-ish seconds of seeing this too. So that's going to be approximately between what? Maybe 50 and 100. So in this area on the timeline, we need the 2 to be kind of discernible as a 2, which it is at the moment. We could start that advection happening because you can still read the 2 once it's been kind of pulled out by the explosion. You can still read it as a 2, so that'll work fine. So I'm saying, and we can obviously make adjustments here, but we want to start this perhaps at around 75, 80. So let's just try it at that. So let's deactivate the system grains now. So Control and Alt, click on the cross, which deactivates everything underneath. And let's reactivate our system EFX. So Control and Alt to reactivate that. And let's just switch off these 2 colliders. In fact, let's put those inside. Let's put these inside our system grains other objects to stay a bit more organized. Excellent. All right, so now we need to keyframe. Remember, we have got our nice box fall off for our emitter, which we can move, which then blasts these particles out. We need to keyframe that at the appropriate point, and it's around frame 75, isn't it? So let's just put it so it's out of the area of the object, so we get no emission. And then at frame 76, let's go to the coordinates. And what we could do is let's hit keyframe on the Y. Then we want to, it wants to be a pretty quick blast this, so let's move it through to say frame 85. Let's put that up and hit another keyframe. And these are going to have, I have my project settings up, so keyframes have a Bezier curve, so there'll be an ease in and an ease out of this animation. Look, it'll start slowly if you watch it and then ramp up and then slow down again. And we want it all just to be a linear animation. So one way of doing that is if I right click here on the Y where we've put our keyframes, I right click, go to animation, and then we can go to show F curve. It'll bring up the timeline, and look, here is the Bezier curve of our animation. So if we just hit Control A to select those points, look, here's the Bezier handles, and we can just click this button here, which will turn it to a linear animation, which is what we want. So now we get this, and watch what happens. We get a blast of particles as it moves up. So that's pretty cool. And we'll just leave it at that for now. We may make adjustments, but for now, that's going to work fine. Okay, excellent. So now what we need to do is set up our xpExplosiaFX. So what we're doing, the reason we're emitting particles from this number 2 is we're going to use those particles to create an xpExplosiaFX simulation. And it's that xpExplosiaFX simulation will be rendering the smoke, but we'll also be using it to advect these grains particles. So that's what we're going to get set up now. So let's go to our system EFX, let's go to dynamics, and we'll go to a dynamic object, and we'll bring in an xpExplosiaFX domain. So here is our xpExplosiaFX domain, and we want, obviously everything needs to happen inside of this volume. We can move it back a bit because our fire is going to come out from the side of our number 2. And it's going to curve in towards the number 1, which will live in front of it. So we need this amount of room. Okay, and at the moment, let's just put that voxel size to, it can be, 6. It's just an arbitrary high voxel number, which is going to be a low resolution sim, which while we're setting up, we'll just simulate a bit more quickly. Right, and we'll leave everything else just as default for now. So what we need is we need this emitter, our particle emitter, to be our source for xpExplosiaFX. So let's go to emitter, tags, xParticles tags, and let's put an xpExplosiaFX source tag on there. Nothing will happen because we need to give the particles some fuel. So let's go to emitter, and we can go to extended data, physical data, and let's give it, I don't know, 2 fuel. In fact, let's just give it 1 fuel to start with and see what we get. So now let's have a look. Hit play. All right, so we're kind of getting something. Not quite what we want yet, but we're getting something. So we're getting it moving up. Okay, so it's kind of the start of our effect here. Let's just go to our exposure effects. Let's go to display. You can pick whichever display mode you like. We're on slices at the moment. We can make this look more detailed by adding more slices. So if we put, say, 80, there'll be more slices, and then we can put the resolution up to, say, 150. And you can start seeing a much better representation of that smoke. But by doing that, you're going to slow down playback because it's having to draw more. I like to pick in the mode, instead of slices, let's go for grid, which gives us a kind of dot in each voxel. And we can increase the level of detail. There we go. And I prefer this as a drawing mode. I think you get a better, I feel like I always get a better idea of the smoke and fire. So there we go. So there is our blasting outwards. Okay. So that's all right. One thing that's wrong with this is, look, the smoke's all rising upwards, isn't it? As it would realistically. But we don't really want that. We want it to follow a very specific path. So let's make it not rise upwards. We just want it to kind of turbulently move behind each particle. So we'll go to the exposure effects, to the simulation tab. What we're going to do is just remove all of the gravity. Okay, so now we're not going to have that kind of buoyancy moving upwards. There we go. So that's more like it. So obviously not realistic if you're simulating smoke and fire on Earth. But for us, obviously, this isn't a realistic scene. This is just a stylish MoGraph scene, so that's fine. So you can also see a lot of the smoke is kind of hanging around and lingering. It's not kind of being pulled along by the particle. So to help that, to have these being pulled along a little bit more, what we need to do is go to the emitter tag. And we have this velocity set to 100. We can increase this above 100. So let's put this on, say, 300%. And now what you're going to see is that smoke's going to follow along and continue that movement with the particles. See? And we're not getting it lingering as much. We want some of it, obviously, because we want some nice wisps left behind. But that's basically what we're going for with our smoke and fire sim. But now what we need to do is start controlling where the path of this smoke goes. And we'll do that first by controlling the path of the particles, so they're not just spitting straight out and going off on this trajectory. So we'll do the path of the particles first, and then we'll be able to get the smoke to follow that path as well. And we're going to get lots of control here, but it's going to look really fluid and organic. So let's get that set up now. We'll go to our Dynamics menu in our System EFX, and what we want is we want to bring in a flow field. We're going to make a custom force field here. So let's go to flow field. And here it is. So it is in its default state. Let's just make our xpExplosiaFX, let's disable that for now. So now the flow field is by default set to a directional force, and it's on the +Z direction. So if we watch our particles, they get spat out and then they get forced back in this +Z direction. Okay, so that's obviously not what we want, but the flow field is working. Let's just move our flow field a bit, because what we're going to do is, if you look at my mouse cursor, we're going to have our particles be spat out on the normal, curve round, and come down and meet where our number 1 geometry is going to be. So we want this curving here, and then underneath, and then all the way around the sides as well. So that's what we're going to get set up. Before we start messing around with the flow field, let's get our number 1 geometry sorted, because that's going to help us with setting up these custom velocity fields. So what we will do is let's go into our system grains system, and we will get our, say, number 2, and let's just make a bit of room here. Let's hit Control and hold it. Drag that to make a copy, and then we'll minimize that system again. Let's make this visible, and this number 2 collider, we don't need the collision tag, so we'll take that off. And obviously we don't want it to be number 2. We want this to be our number 1. So there's our number 1. And let's have a look. We could... Let's rename it before I move it. It'll stop any confusion. Let's just call that 1. And we could move that up into our other objects. Okay, so there's our number 1. So what we want is we want this number 1 to actually be well in front of our number 2. And what's going to happen is the smoke and the explosion and the particles are going to come up here and converge on this number 1. Excellent. So that's kind of what we want. But the problem is, if we come to a camera position that is going to be close to the one, to our final one, if we frame up that number 2, the 1 suddenly looks massive because obviously we're in a perspective camera. It's close to the camera, so it looks huge, even though it's the same size. So what we're going to have to do is scale down our number 1. Now, we can just eyeball this at this stage, but let's just bring this height down. And we want it to be approximately the same size as the 2. So that's maybe slightly bigger. Something like that. So from this view, it looks like they're both the same size, which is obviously what we want when we're transitioning from a 2 to 1. But in reality, the 1's a lot smaller than the 2. But that's not a problem. This is all about trickery. Okay, so what we want, if we hit play now, we don't want our particles to emit and be forced to go in the +Z by the flow field. We want to create these shapes. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to draw some splines. And the fantastic thing about this is you can draw the spline whatever shape you want and get the particles and the exposure effects simulation to respect that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to my orthographic view. So if we hit F5, we get all of them. And look, we want this side-on view, this right view. So now I can see that if I hit this button here, click on that, and then we get to our full view, which is looking from the right. So if we look at this, this is the side of our number 2. This is the side of our number 1. And here is our emitter box fall off. If I just hit play, you'll see those particles moving. So what we want to do is we want to draw a spline that curves like this. And we just need to do 1, and then we can make copies. So let's go to our spline tools, and we'll just hit the pen tool. So by default, this is set to Bezier spline type. So I'm going to stick with Bezier. You can pick some of these other spline types if you would prefer, and that may work for you. But I think for us, Bezier is going to work well. So what we want is, let's start here, click and hold and drag your handles up. There we go, then let go. Then about here, click and drag to the left. Great. And then here, let's click and drag down. And then let go and press escape. And there we have our spline. So we can make adjustments to this should we wish, but that's looking all right for now. So now if we hit F1, it's a shortcut to go back to perspective view. So now look, we've drawn our spline like this. Okay, good. So now what we want to do is we want to kind of clone these to make it look a little bit like a petal of a flower. So that's really quick. Let's go to MoGraph, bring in a cloner. Let's put our spline as a child of the cloner. Now, by default, let's have a look at the cloner settings. Our cloner is set to linear to make 3 copies on the +Y. So we've got our 3 copies. Let's change it from linear to radial. And look, straight away, we've got the kind of look that we want. Let's say let's keep it odd. We'll have 9 splines. Good. And then let's just reduce that radius down so they're all coming in and converging. Yep, that's looking pretty good. Excellent. That's looking good. Right, so what do we need to do now? Well, we're going to use this spline inside our flow field to create this kind of customized velocity field. But what we need to do is we need to connect them and make it editable for it to work. So let's go to our Cinema 4D menu to bring in a connect object. We'll put the cloner inside the connect. And then if we go on the connect and let's just hit C, which makes it editable. Look, so now we just have one spline, which is all of ours linked together. And we can still edit this. Look, we can still change these Bezier handles, but it's now considered to be one spline object. Very nice. So let's now go to our flow field. Let's activate the flow field. Now you can see our vectors pointing back in the +Z. And that's because we have flow set to default, which is +Z. Let's change that to a long spline. So now we don't have any because it doesn't have a spline to reference. So we need to drag in. Let's just rename this connect. Let's call this splines. And in our flow field, let's drag in. Oh, let's go to Object tab. Let's drag in our splines. And now look, you can see we have got our vectors going in the direction of our lines. Fantastic. So we don't actually want any fall off. We want these to be kind of happening within the entire bounds of the flow field. So let's just switch off fall off. And what we're going to want is, at the moment, the cell size is set to 40 centimeters. And we want a little bit more accuracy in this. And so, that, again, it's like xpExplosiaFX. If you want more accuracy, you need a smaller cell size. So let's put them down to, say, I don't know, 17 or 18, something like that. So a much more detailed cell size. Then I'm going to go to display. Let's turn off our vectors so we can see more clearly. All right, let's go back to our general tab and let's have a look. I mean, we'll see how this is looking. So at the moment, we're going to get our particles coming off, and then, yeah, look, it is working. They're moving up, and they are following this. So it's not quite strong enough, is it? Because we want them to be coming towards the one, because we haven't got enough strength in our flow field. So let's put this way up to, I don't know, say 40. So now it's much stronger. Let's have a look. Yes, that's following it more closely, isn't it? That's looking pretty good. Now we're getting some weird behavior here, but we're going to sort that out a little bit later. Looking good. So we've managed to make our custom flow field using these splines, which is going to get our xpExplosiaFX source particles to follow these arcs. And of course you can adjust these and we'll have whatever splines that you want, and you're going to get this fantastic look of the smoke following them along. So it basically gives you the chance to really easily art direct where smoke is going to go, but it will still look organic and look like it's behaving naturally like smoke, but following these paths. So that is a really fantastic and very powerful technique. So we will start making some adjustments and we'll link this up to the xpExplosiaFX and start refining this simulation a bit more. So what we'll do is let's activate our xpExplosiaFX and we'll hit play. So here comes our explosion. That's looking good. Now, at the moment, it's a little bit difficult to see what our particles are doing. So let's go to our emitter. We'll go to our display options, and we're going to be playing around with the radius of these particles. And in dot editor display mode, you can't see what that radius is. So let's change that to circles, which will give us an idea of the radius of those particles. Then I'm going to go back to my emission tab. So there we go. There are particles. So let's make a few adjustments here. First of all, the lifespan. We don't want these particles to be alive forever because they'll just keep producing smoke. And look, as they're moving this way, they're still creating smoke and still creating smoke. And we kind of want them to die off, really. So let's just have a look. We want them to last until they're kind of just about getting to the number 1, and then we want them to die off. So kind of at that point, we kind of want them starting to die off. So let's just say we don't want full lifespan. Let's try, say, I don't know, 60 frames. We'll have a little bit of variation as well, so not everyone is dying at the same time. Let's have a look at what that gives us. I think they're possibly moving a little bit too quickly as well, these particles, but let's have a look. So then they start dying off. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Maybe alive a little bit too long, but let's see. Let's reduce their speed down a little bit. We'll put it down to, say, I don't know, 130. So the overall speed's going to be 130, a bit slower. But what we could do is add a little bit of variation to that speed. So if we put, say, a variation of 30 in, what it's saying is the particle's speed will be anything from 130 less 30 to 130 plus 30. So anything within that range. So let's have a look. I think arguably we've got slightly too many particles as well. Let's have a look as we go. There we go. Looking nice. Dying off. Very good. Let's reduce the birth rate. So we've got 1,000 being generated per second, which is probably too much. Let's put that down to, say, I don't know, 300. And that'll be far fewer. And what we could do, there's also one issue. When you have particle as an emitter source for exposure effects, if there are two particles born kind of all overlapping, it's kind of doubling up the fuel value in that area, and we could get kind of blobs where actually what we really want is kind of like fuel tendrils, smoke tendrils. We don't really want lots of particles being born very close together because we don't want those blobs. So what we could do is we could select this no intersection button. And if we do that, what it basically means is if a particle is born in an intersected state from our number 2 geometry, one of them will be killed. It just won't be born. They're not allowed to be born in an intersected state. So you'll have far fewer particles, but the result is they won't be born touching, and you're not going to get these big blobs of fuel. Now we've got far fewer particles, you'll see we've hardly got any smoke. And that is because especially at this resolution, our particle radius just isn't big enough. The voxel size is too big to be able to detect all of these particles. So let's just put that up. We'll put this radius up to, say, I don't know, 5. Let's put a bit of variation on this as well. So some of them will actually, if we put 2 variation, some of these particles will actually be 7 centimeters. So let's have a look. And now you'll see we'll get a lot more smoke. Here they come. Not too much, actually. So at this voxel size, with this radius, there's just not enough information for them to be catching fire. We are going to be reducing the voxel size, but until we do, let's just put this up to, say, 8 centimeters for these particles. Let's have a look, and we'll see more smoke this time. There we go. So loads more smoke. So we'll leave it at 8 for now, but when we go to exposure effects and reduce this voxel size in this grid, we'll reduce this radius way down, maybe to 5, 4, something like that. Okay, so that's looking good. We're starting to get some nice tendrils following along. Now, at the moment, this smoke is just following the direction that our particles is giving it. It's kind of working, but what we can do is we can give it a helping hand. So if we go to our exposure effects, you will see that there is a modifiers tab here, and we can include xParticles modifiers. So look, let's drag in our flow field. And now this smoke is going to be forced in the direction of these splines as well. So it's getting its velocity from the particles, but then the direction is helping it along with our arrows. Okay, and we're starting to get the look that we want now, all kind of congregating here around our number 1. So that's looking pretty decent. one thing we can see is, look, you can see they're not actually intersecting the one. Now, we may make adjustments. We could actually move the geometry later. But one thing we are able to do is if we take our spline, this is a spline that we've used in our flow field. Let's go into point mode. And what we could do is if we go to the rectangular selection tool and we can just select all of these points. Look, we can just, because these are Bezier splines, we can just move it in a bit like this, look. Okay, very good. And let's just leave it at that for now. Let's have a look and see what, if any, difference that makes to our flow field. So here it comes. And then, yeah, look, they're moving much more tightly, and now they've moved into our geometry. So that's good, and the beauty of having these splines is it remains completely adjustable throughout, so that's really cool. Very nice. All right. So we're getting there. So remember, we're going to be using this smoke to render. We're going to be rendering this smoke as an effect, but we're also going to use this simulation to advect our grains particles. So let's have a look at how we would set that up. So what we need to do, obviously, is reactivate our grains system here. So let's just hold Control Alt and click on the cross, and now that's all activated again. Now, we need to start being careful and being organized here, because we now have two xParticle systems in our object manager, one for the xpExplosiaFX sim and one for the grains. Now, as it stands, this emitter will be affected by any modifiers that we have in this scene and also any dynamic solvers that we have going as well. But it will also be affected by all of these modifiers and dynamic objects, which are in the other xParticle system. And we need to be careful because obviously we don't want kind of cross-pollination of these effects in some instances, and we do in others. So let's just have a think about that. For our emitter that is creating our smoke and fire simulation, we don't need these particles to be affected by anything in this system grains system. We don't need the fluid effects, we don't need any of those modifiers, the color, the gravity, anything to be affecting this emitter. So one good way of doing that would be is if we go to our system object at the top, and if we go down to the settings here, look, you can see we have an only modifiers in same system checkbox. So if we check this, that means that this emitter will only follow any modifiers or dynamic objects that are in the same system. And because all of these modifiers are in the grain system, it's going to ignore them. So that's going to work as far as that one goes. So that's excellent. However, our system grains, this we have, look, our grains emitter. Now this is being controlled by this fluid effects dynamics object and all of these modifiers. But if we leave it as is, it will automatically be affected by this flow field as well. So we need to kind of disclude it from that. However, we want it to be affected by other things, like we want it to be affected by the exposure effects, by the advection that we set up in here. So we can't just go to the system and put only modifiers in same system, because we want it to be affected by this exposure effects. So we can't do that. So how do we get around it? Well, what we'll do in this instance is we'll go to the emitter in question. Let's jog up a bit of room again. And we have, look, a modifiers tab in that emitter. And we can either include or exclude certain modifiers. So let's keep it on exclude. And what we want to exclude from our grains particles is the flow field. Let's just drag in that flow field. So now it's going to ignore the flow field. Excellent. And we'll probably be putting some other elements in this exclude as and when we add them. All right. So let's close those back up. So now, if we hit play, our grains should be born as we would expect. Let's have a look. There's our grains. And so now, because we've reactivated our grain sim, everything should be working as normal. Look, the gravity is animating on via this box field. It's colliding with our number 2 collider object. Gravity is forcing the grains backwards. We're getting this really nice crumbling. Some of them are staying on the surface, which is revealing our number 2. And then when we get to a round frame, it was approximately frame 70, wasn't it? We will then get our particles emitting from the sides of this number 2 geo, creating our smoke and fire sim. So here we go. There they come. Here's a smoke and fire. But nothing's happening. Nothing's being moved by those. Look, they're just staying still. We're getting this nice simulation. But those number 2 particles aren't being moved in any way other than the gravity pulling them down. So what we need to do is activate what is called particle advection, which means that the velocity information that's been created by the smoke and fire sim will be passed on to our grains particles, and they'll start moving along with it. So there's a couple of things we need to do to get that kind of prepared for it to work. So what we're going to do here is get the mechanics sorted out first, and once it's working, we can then look at how we're going to art direct this advection. So one of the mechanics and one of the very important steps here is this. We have 2 dynamics solvers live in this scene. Well, we have 3, but let's ignore the flow field for now. We have an xpExplosiaFX and we have a fluidFX. So let's go to the xpExplosiaFX. We want to use the velocity information from this xpExplosiaFX and pass it on into our grains particles. So to do that, we go to the xpExplosiaFX body and we go to the Advection tab and we highlight Advect Particles. Now, these are all the different channels of data that xpExplosiaFX generates, and then if we have them set on 100%, it will pass these on to the particles. Now, we don't want to pass on any smoke information, any burn, any temperature, any colour, or any UV. We just want to pass on the velocity information. But here's the problem. We already have fluidFX set up to make these emitter grains particles behave in a granular fluid-like way. And fluidFX is taking over the velocity of these particles and working out that velocity. And now that we have selected advection in our xpExplosiaFX object, this too is going to try and sort out and move those particles, control those particle velocities. And these two can't work together. They're going to be fighting against each other to dictate how these particles move. So this is what we need to do. As soon as the xpExplosiaFX sim starts, which is around frame 75, we need to deactivate the fluidFX. We need to stop the fluidFX from solving the grain particles' velocity. Otherwise, xpExplosiaFX isn't going to be able to do its thing. So, let's have a look at how that is going to work. If we hit play now, you will see that our grain sim is going to start. Let's have a look. They're all falling down as normal. Nothing seems to have changed. Okay, now they go. So there is our sim. However, can you see that we have this cube? See this yellow cube? And within that yellow cube, our fluidFX sim hasn't worked as it had before. Look, these are remaining static, these particles. And it's not working as it did. Now they're slightly moving because they are still kind of attached to the rest. But look, can you see we're not getting much movement within this cube? What is it? Well, what this cube is the adaptive bounds of our xpExplosiaFX. And one of the quirks of xpExplosiaFX, one of its behaviors is that if you have adaptive bounds selected before you get any xpExplosiaFX simulation going on, you get this starting point adaptive bounds. Now, we could switch that off. If we went to the xpExplosiaFX object, go to the solver, and if we deselect adaptive bounds, take it off, resim, you'll see that that cube has disappeared. And now this will start working as normal. But the problem with that is that xpExplosiaFX on every frame is solving every single voxel within this body, whether it needs to or not, because we've removed that adaptive bounds that restricts it. So it's a much slower way of simulating. So we don't really want to do that. We want to use adaptive, but we get this problem of this, this initial adaptive bounds box. So this is what we're going to do to get around that. We're going to go to the xpExplosiaFX and let's go to the advection and let's just keyframe this velocity amount. So if we start with this on, say, 0, and let's start it on 0, well, let's just play through it and see. So basically, we want this to be not advecting these particles whatsoever, so then it doesn't matter what's happening inside this adaptive bounds. So if we just keep this going, and you'll see that those particles now that were inside there and were getting a little bit frozen are acting as they should do. So they're not being advected at all. We haven't got two solvers fighting over which one's controlling velocity. So that's good. And then when we get to the bit where the xpExplosiaFX sim starts to happen, here it comes. So we're keeping an eye out for when this emitter fall off animates. Here it comes. So there, that's where it starts. And we're starting to get this explosion. But look, because we've got no velocity, this movement hasn't created any movement in our sand. So let's just go back a couple of frames to this frame here. And what we're going to do is we'll go back one more frame. Keyframe velocity there. Let's move forward a few frames and put that velocity onto full. There we go. So now let's have a look. So now what we should have is our particles will behave as we expect and they will fall down, and at the moment it is FluidFX which is controlling the velocity of these particles. We've got xpExplosiaFX active, but there is no velocity at this point, so it isn't trying to advect anything at all. As soon as the xpExplosiaFX simulation starts to happen, the adaptive bounds will be correctly calculated. We are then animating up the velocity, which will start moving the particles. But it's still not going to work as we hope, because the FluidFX is still active. Let's have a look here. So here it comes. So there is a problem. We're starting to get a little bit of smoke and fire, but it's absolutely not working as we expect. And that's because the FluidFX is still active and it's not allowing these particles to move. So what we need to do is keyframe the FluidFX, the basic tab, just keyframe when it's enabled. So we want it to be enabled all the way up to frame, let's go to the xpExplosiaFX object. Here is where we want to deactivate our FluidFX. So it's on this keyframe here, which is frame, what's that? Frame 77. So let's go to FluidFX. And we'll go one more frame forward. Let's activate it, and then next frame, and let's deactivate it. So now let's have a look. So Fluid Effects is up and running at this point, and Fluid Effects is working out the velocity of these particles, and it is doing it in a granular way, and it's looking great. Our Exposure Effects is active, but we have no velocity advection going on, so this initial bounding box issue isn't causing us problems. As soon as the Exposure Effects sim starts, the adaptive box is correct, and we animate up that velocity of the advection, and at the same time we deactivate the Fluid Effects, so it is no longer trying to control the advection. So let's see what happens now. This is the point where the sim starts, and something really weird is going on. It's kind of working, isn't it? But all of a sudden, our particles aren't really spitting out and following the flow field anymore. They're not behaving like they were. What's going wrong? Well, this is another bit of a gotcha when you're using particle advection. What is happening is these particles, our emitter particles, are creating the fire and the smoke, but then they are being advected by the same smoke that they've just created, which is messing up their movement. So we need to go to this emitter, and we need to go to the modifiers tab, and we need to exclude the advection. So to exclude the advection, we need to drag in the xpExplosiaFX object. So now let's have a go. And we're inching closer to getting this simulation to be working, the mechanics of this simulation to be working how we want it. So here we go. So now we have got this crumbling as we would expect. Fluid Effects is in charge of this sim, and it's sorting out all the velocity. As we approach frame 76, the Fluid Effects will be switched off, so it's no longer calculating the velocity, and that's when the xpExplosiaFX velocity calculations take over with the particle advection. But now our emitter particles will be moving correctly and not being advected themselves, and there we go. So now they're moving outwards in the motion that we were expecting. Let's just deactivate the visibility of our sim. So now we're kind of getting closer to something that we want. We're wanting these particles to be kind of explode outwards with this xpExplosiaFX sim. But it's not quite right yet. We've got a little bit more work to do before we've got this looking and feeling as we want it. But this has become a very long scene, so we will leave this video here. Let's get saved up, and in the next video we will pick up from this point and refine this simulation.